Cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks for being here right before lunch. So I switched up the topic a little bit. We're going to be talking about growing Ethereum's real economy. And just a disclaimer, if this works. Is the clicker thing on? Okay. This is my opinion. This is not the Ethereum Foundation's opinion, but I just wanted to share my thoughts on this. Closer? Okay, thanks. So what is the real economy? So this is an analogy that helps you think about it. The real economy is to goods and services, as the financial economy is to money. So what does that mean? If you look at some examples, so let's look at a couple of examples. If you look at a country, you can look at a country's GDP. The US has like $18 trillion worth of GDP. But what that really is trying to measure is how much goods and services are exchanged in a country within that time period. And if you look at a company, it's how much revenue or market cap that they may have. But the reason why we do that is it's just easy to compare the value that a phone company is making compared to what a grocer is making. So in reality, the real economy of a phone company is the number of phones that it sells, the phone calls that it charges for. And it's not just for big entities. If you look at a meal that you're going to have, the $10 is the financial economy, whereas the real economy is the actual sandwich. Like, how much do you enjoy eating that? So why are we talking about this at all for Ethereum? So money, I think there's a lot of ways to think about money, but one way that's interesting is that it's just a claim on the real goods and services within a given economy. So for an economy to be valuable, after its bootstrap, we can think about money, how to put debt or equity, what's the price of a token. But in reality, it boils down to how useful are the goods and services that you can access within that economy. So what's Ethereum's real economy? Like, what do people use it for? So what we often talk about technically is, well, you can put a bid on the space for transactions or computation to include in a block in a blockchain. But the question then is, why do people do that? So if you honestly look at why that's happening, some use cases here, ranging from speculation, access to capital, payments, digital collectibles. We'll talk a little bit about these. But the really key point comes down to what's the inherent and defensible advantage that a smart contract platform has? We have to think, like, why are we doing this with a decentralized network? Because the cloud infrastructure that we already have today is very optimized for price and speed. So unless it has new features that we're talking about, we shouldn't build it on a blockchain. So oftentimes we can start thinking about, well, what the product is and can we put it on a blockchain? But I think a nice shortcut is, what are the interesting features and how can we experiment with those? So blockchains have a lot of features, but I think some of the features that really stand out to me are digital scarcity, programmable money, and censorship resistance. So let's talk briefly about what that means. Digital scarcity, if you look at the internet developing over a 20-year period, it was really about information being free, but copies. I can send you a copy and you have it. But you don't, I can still have that copy. But digital scarcity means now I have a technology where I can send you something and I can have proof that I don't have it anymore. So if you really think about that, that's one of the fundamental innovations in blockchain technology, because more of the world can become digital, because now transactions that mirror real-world transactions can be represented on the blockchain with digital scarcity. Programmable money means building on top of this digital scarcity. What else can you do on top of it? Why do you pay a bank to do what it does? Because if something goes wrong, they'll maintain it. They'll create the product or the structure of what you want. But if you can do that with code independently written by a developer, based on this digital scarcity that we talked about, what kind of interesting digital economies can we build that is machine to machine? And lastly, censorship resistance. I think Akasha talked about this quite a bit. But right now, all of our data lives within centralized data servers. So that's most likely fine. But in cases like Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, sometimes it's not. So it's more expensive on a unit cost basis to put things on a decentralized server, but sometimes we want to have the option to be censorship resistant and to own our data. So if you look at use cases today, quite frankly, a lot of the things that are bootstrapping Ethereum's interests are around speculation and raising funds and payments. But that's okay, it's still early. I think that as we develop the technology, it's going to look more like this, where a lot more digital collectibles, so it's digital scarcity, programmable money, and uncensorable apps become more of the use cases that drive why Ethereum is important. And if you noticed, payments went from red to blue in this. Why is that? So a little side note here is that there's a lot of interesting approaches around stable coins. But stability is like a very interesting concept, right? Because something can be stable against like a 10% volatility, but can the same thing be stable against like a 90% volatility, right? So I think that true black swan type stability comes from usage, not engineering. And this is why if there's more usage happening, looking at these bottom three features, it can be a more useful way to do payments as well. So Ethereum's real economy comes down to what kind of useful experiences can you have on top of Ethereum that you can't have in other places. And the real economy, just in the same way the US GDP is all the goods and services exchanged in that place, for Ethereum is some of all the useful experiences that you can have on top of it, on all the applications on top. So how can we prioritize usefulness? We talk a lot about scalability, and that's really good. But there are two things. We need to scale. And this doesn't mean we just wait. This doesn't mean we just throw money at the problem. We need to either scale and solve this as soon as possible, or I think we need to relax the assumptions about decentralization so that we can start testing some of these features of a blockchain. Because I think the largest gain in decentralization comes from trusting one person to two people. And then you have more decentralization as you add more people, but it's diminishing returns. Secondly, we need to iterate with users. Right now, we have a lot of big ideas. We pitch it with investors and each other. And I think that's really important to get the imagination going. But then from there, we need to start testing small ideas with customers and users that don't believe in our ideas. Because if they don't believe it, then what are we doing this for? Who is this going to be useful for? So we talked about the real economy and why that's important, but how do we incentivize this? How do we make this happen? I don't think I need to talk a lot about this slide. The incentives right now are towards, it's harder to do product to not raise money, to test your ideas first. Because what we're talking about is a huge opportunity, so I think it makes sense that there's a lot of capital coming in. But to combat that, not combat, but to stabilize the need and the incentives for building product and scaling, how do we fix this? And the obvious answer that we've been talking about a lot is grants. And I think this is a really great way to engage with the community to make sure that projects that are not funded are funded. But the problem with grants in the long term is that, oh, I think I missed a slide there, is, well, quite frankly, they run out. It's not a sustainable business model. We have a lot of funding. The Ethereum Foundation is not afraid to use all the funding to support the community. But in a long enough time scale, it's going to run out. And number two, that model is not, it can be open to markets crashing, and all of a sudden, in the time that you need it the most, you have less capital available. So one way to think about inflation is that it's a form of taxation. And that sounds horrible, right? Who wants taxes? But the reason why taxes are important is that let's say you move to a city and the city has no roads. So if you look at an extreme where it's not, a city or organization doesn't have enough taxes, you actually don't have enough common infrastructure to do the things that you want to do. So the reason why you can think about inflation as taxation is that, let's say you have 10 apples in an economy, and you have $10 in an economy, and you decide to increase the number of dollars in the economy by $10, so you have $20 in the economy, and that's all there is, then most likely the price of apples are going to go from $1 to 50 cents because there are more claims on the real goods and services, the apples in the economy. So that's why it's very similar to, instead of taking your money, I can just say, well, more things in the world have claims to things that you could have bought with this. So let's think about a simple example. You have this amazing city plan. You're living in Toronto and your friend says, hey, I think there's like a lot of things that we can improve about the city. There's a lot of centralization. We want to decentralize a couple of things. And the friend says, well, you're one of like 100 people that are invited. Some people know how to build buildings. Some people have money. We're going to all get together and build this amazing city. And your friend then says, well, the way the plan is going to work is that since you're an amazing architect, you're going to build a building for us. Okay, and I say yes. And your friend tells you, okay, when the city is done, we're going to allocate the apartments based on how much you invested. Then as an architect, you start thinking, well, how about all the work that I did to build something for everybody? So I think that's why there's a coordination failure here, because even though there's a good plan, even though there's enough capital, even though there's enough talent, you didn't put together the coordination in the right way to make the real economy happen, this new city happen. So how can you fix this? One simple example is you strike a deal. You say, well, everyone that invested, you get a pro rata share of the building, but I'm going to create, I'm going to keep 30% of the rooms or create 30% more rooms, and that's going to be solely dedicated to people that build. And in that case, I made this like random math that says if the economy does well, like 20% annual growth, then for certain investors, even if you take a large dilution like 30%, they end up doing much better than the stock market, even assuming like a very average scenario. So without going into too much detail about this, the point is that all participants can benefit if real economic value is being created, even if the people that are putting in capital get diluted. So this is why inflation can be good. It provides sustainability because unlike grants, inflation doesn't run out. And it provides coordination, meaning if there are a number of things that in the real economy that can come together to create more real economic benefit, we should make that happen. And inflation can be a way to do that. And a really intuitive way to say this to like a 5-year-old is, why don't you just take a slightly smaller slice of a much bigger pie? That's the way to think about it. So this one's a little bit subtle. You get into crypto, you start learning about Bitcoin, you start thinking about digital gold, and what you start thinking about is, wow, like if there's limited supply of something, I really want to get a piece of that. But the problem with the human brain and linguistics and our language is that we don't really think in derivatives, in the rate of change. So I think that the real answer to go for here is not limited supply, but the real economic growth within an economy growing at a faster rate than the inflation. So inflation here is subsidizing the real economic growth, and as long as there's more growth than how much you're subsidizing it by, that's a really good deal. So how do you think about how much to inflate? There are different economies, different cryptocurrencies. Like sounds like a good idea, but how do you even think about how much you should inflate compared to other economies? So one proxy is how much have you executed versus how big is your vision? So one example, if you look at Bitcoin's vision, it's a distributed ledger. It's really focusing on censorship-resistant payments and store of value. And I don't know how to put a number on this, but if I said if it's 75% technically done, I don't think I would get too many disagreements. It's like on the high side of completion. If you look at Ethereum, no matter what you think the execution level might be, the goal is a little bit more technically ambitious. We want to put a virtual machine on top of it. So if your vision is larger, then you have a lot more to grow. So if you have a further way to go, then I think you have to be comfortable with potentially inflating more to be able to make those coordination. So this is a little bit more detail on how I'm thinking about it. So if the execution versus vision, so the percentage completion of your vision is low, then you should be able to inflate more. And as a side note, for governance, you should be a little bit more lenient. At this point, it should be about building and participating rather than saying, hey, my wealth is going to be diluted by 1%. Because that doesn't matter. Either this is going to be a big new economy or it's going to be nothing. And this is a very simple graphic representation, right? As a percentage completion goes up, you have to be a lot more conservative, but in the beginning, you can be very aggressive. Okay, so we're going to do some math. Roughly what you need to follow here is you have the Ethereum market cap. Today, it's around at $70 billion. And we're looking at various levels of inflation. So the point I'm trying to make here is I'm not pitching like 100% inflation here. Right now, if you look at the block reward, it's about $5 billion a year, $15 million yesterday. So that's about 6 to 7% inflation, like more ether coming into the system. $5 billion, that's a whole lot of money. So even if we look at like 1% inflation at our market cap, that's another $700 million worth, or at 1.5%, $1 billion worth of capital. I actually don't know what we would do with all that capital. So the point is, it can be very small amounts of inflation, even 0.1% would get you above $100 million or so. So where would that capital even go, theoretically speaking? We can do Millennium Prize style bounties. So if you have a client that solves sharding, I'm making up numbers here, but here's $10 million in a smart contract that you can take because everyone else thanks you for your work. And that $10 million is really cheap compared to the value that it provides for the entire economy. You can provide non-dilutive funding for teams. So a lot of teams build on Ethereum. And I think venture capitalists are doing an amazing job funding the right projects to try different things, to be frank. But what if we had an option to have non-dilutive funding available to them so that they can be in charge of their entire destiny? Funding for community-organized events like EdCon and like the EIP0 that happened earlier this week. I think that should be all funded by the entire community because they're all benefiting from it. So why haven't we done this? I've talked to people that have a lot more context than I do, and some of the reasons that come up are, one, there's this supply cap meme. If you go on Twitter, everyone's talking about, oh, you're creating inflation. Are you like a central bank? What are you doing? Like, this is all about digital scarcity. And the problem with, I think, the general online media today is that there's lack of subtlety. There's only limited supply or just printing money like crazy. But in reality, there are subtle answers where you can create the right amount of incentives without doing any harm to people. And number two is, even if we decide to do this, and I think this is something the existing team has said, is that it's hard to implement. Even if we all agree that we should print more money, who's going to be in charge of the governance? We have enough governance improvements that we have to make anyway, so how are we going to add this on top of the burden? So we have some open questions to think about, which is, if we were to do this, what percentage do we inflate by? How do we govern this? Those are really hard problems. And I encourage you to reach out to people in the ecosystem because a lot of people are very open about thinking about governance issues and research issues. So we can all think about this. But I just wanted to start the discussion for all of us. Some takeaways. One, we should build the real economy. The rest will follow. We don't need to micro-optimize the inflation rate. We don't need to think about anything else. We just need to make usefulness, and the rest will follow. Number two, we should build for the long term. The Ethereum Foundation will do everything to support building real product, but there should be teams thinking about how do we make this long term, because we're eventually going to run out of money. And lastly, as we think about inflation or monetary policy or governance, we should always think about how mature is the project today compared to where we want to go. Because the longer the way you have to go, the more aggressive you have to be or more lenient you have to be. Lastly, why does this all matter? So the theme for EdCon this year was never forget why you started, and I think that's thinking about Vitalik and why he's from Toronto. But I think that once you get into crypto, it's very easy to start thinking about intellectually what is the right solution, or philosophically what's the right solution, or start thinking about competition like EOS or something else. But I think it's not really about any of those things. Like especially, it's not about competition. It's about, as an entire space as cryptocurrencies, can we provide value for everybody else or not? And I think that's the bottom line. And I think we should really focus on providing end user experiences that were not possible with the existing infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. That's a good conversation starter when you're out